how stretching the gap in the LinkedIn DMs will help you close more deals. That's the topic of today's episode of the How to Make Money as a Creator podcast. If you don't know who I am, my name is Matthew Lakajev. I run a program called 7 Figure Creators where we help business owners and creators on LinkedIn drive 6 then 7 figures of revenue to their business through LinkedIn as the lead source. The topic of this episode was, I was thinking about this the other day when I was chatting to the sales team and around like creating a gap. And I'll tell you a little story about this before we get into it. And the impact of why it matters. So back when I was at Zoom, I worked at Zoom, the video conferencing company, I was in the role of a small medium business salesperson. And I was in that role after COVID. So I was at Zoom before COVID when no one knew about Zoom meetings. Like I remember people told me at the time, they're like, we don't need Zoom meetings, we only meet in person. I remember the owner of a legal firm telling me that. It was such a lol. And then during COVID, where everyone just was buying Zoom on autopilot, and then post-COVID, where Zoom is now getting demolished by Microsoft Teams, and the only thing we could sell at Zoom was a phone system. That's it. So, and Zoom actually has a phone system, literally like picking up the phone, right? But it's a cloud-based phone system, which means it's in an app on your phone, much easier to use and manage. It's actually really phenomenally good. So when I was in the small medium business role, everyone knew that you couldn't come into a company that had Microsoft Teams and sell to them. It was just like a no-go. It's just like impossible to do. So you pretty much just give up. And so what people were doing though, the way they were making sales and the way I made sales is I sold a thing called Zoom Phone, which is their phone system. And I ended up selling the most Zoom Phone in the whole of small medium business globally within a year. I did like 73 Zoom Phone deals. So that was my specialty. I actually went after to work and co-founded another company with Michael, which we sold phone systems, right? That was before this. Now, at the time, I remember doing outreach and reaching out to people to, see who wanted to buy the phone system. And I remember at the time, everyone at the company, they used to reach out to all like the software companies, like the cool software companies or like the cool finance companies or just those companies which everyone really thinks of. Like it's like why so many people want to sell to like SaaS startups or founders, which is actually the worst people to sell to, and I'll tell you why in a second. But like everyone sold to like these software companies, but when they were selling to them, they weren't having the most success. And when I was like really looking into it, I kind of started understanding why. Because I thought about it logically, because I previously didn't have any sales experience, so I just came into Zoom with no sales experience, no pre-bias information in my mind. And I remember looking at it and thinking like why are they selling to a software company? For one, a lot of them don't even use phones, they just use Slack. And two, a lot of them are really tech savvy, so they probably got the Zoom phone set up as well. They probably got another phone system like called 8x8 or Ring Central and stuff like that, right? And like they were like, sure, Zoom Phone was better than Ring Central, but Ring Central was still quite good. And so I remember thinking about someone like, say, my dad. And my dad owns like a panel beating shop, so he fixes cars for a living. He owns a business. He's done that for like 40 years, right, in his shop. And I remember like going to his work one day, and I remember seeing like the phones on his wall, like the actual physical phones. And I remember thinking, Dad, like, did you know there's a phone system where you don't have to have the phone on your wall? Like you can have an app on your phone, so when they ring your business number, not your mobile phone, but your business number, it comes through on your phone as well. So even if you're out and you're doing the banking or you're going to get lunch and you close the shop, you can still receive a phone call to that number. And he's like, man, I didn't even know that existed. That's like amazing. I would like love to get that. And then I was like, yeah, did you know that like Pete, who works for you, like Pete could also, if Pete picks up the call, he could then transfer the call to you, and then you'll be, my dad could be even overseas. Like he could be he went to Italy with my mum like a couple of years back, and so he could have transferred the call to him. It was an emergency, and he's like, wow, that's like insane. I didn't even know this technology existed. And then I remember thinking, man, there must be so many businesses that like don't even know this technology existed, and there must be so many businesses still using like old school actual phone systems. And I'm not saying that physical phones are going to go away, because they still have uses, right? Especially if you're in a factory and certain offices, right? They still have use, but like what happens like when they need to transfer someone to somewhere else? And then I remember what I did is I was like, okay, cool. So let's say there's a software company. Like what's the polar opposite of a software company? Like, so a software company has all the tech. They don't really need to use a phone system. So what are the industries that need phone systems, don't have the best tech, aren't the most tech savvy industries? Maybe I'll reach out to them. And so what I did is then I just reached out to logistics companies, manufacturing companies, farming, healthcare, like old school healthcare, non-profits, like they're really old school companies. And I remember like I'd get onto the call with these people and I would chat to them like, yeah, this is like, we've got this phone system. And at the time, like, I'm not going to say I was an outreach whiz then at all. All I had to do to get a meeting at the time, just after COVID, was I sent an email to someone saying, hey, I'm Matt from the Sydney office of Zoom. Do you want to meet Zoom? You've got a few Zoom licenses. And I got heaps of meetings like that. So I got like 700 and something meetings that year. So I'm not claiming that it was hard to sell, but like it was easy to get a meeting, right? Super easy. Zoom at the time, everyone wanted to chat to Zoom because they're like, oh my God, I use Zoom to chat with my parents during COVID, which was like, is a massive thing, right? And so I remember getting onto like my first few clients and I remember like, then I was like, hey, Zoom's got like a phone system as well, like on the meeting. I used to say that to them and they're like, oh no, like that's pretty cool. And I was like, hey, do you want me to show you how to use it? And they're like, cool. And I was like, cool, I'll just like call you now. And I remember like showing my screen or sharing my mobile phone and pulling up the Zoom phone app and then like calling them. And they were like, whoa, that's sick. And I remember demoing it on the call. I was like, I'd transfer a phone call from someone to another person. And they'd be like, my God, this is like amazing. Like, so like, and how does it work with the shops? And I remember getting into these discussions. I remember these two guys, I can't remember their names, but like they owned like a, what was the company? I'm pretty sure, I don't know if it was like a butcher, but like, no, it was like some manufacturing company. It was a manufacturing company and it was in Queensland. They had like 6 different locations. And I remember for them, phone systems was always a massive issue. Phones always going down, never could get into contact with anyone. And I remember we set up the phone system with them and the cost of their phone system went down from like $2,500 a month to like $500 a month. Well, no, I think their bill in the end was like $360. I remember that visually. And it was like 10 times better what they were using. It was like so easy to manage because the other phone system like was like with the IT people, right? And like, and then I remember like thinking like, I remember giving it to them and them being like, man, this has like absolutely changed our whole entire lives. And I remember thinking back on it now is like, to me then it was obvious, but people still try and sell things to like SaaS startups and all this kind of stuff. But the problem with like selling to all these types of businesses is they don't have a big enough gap. See, all these businesses I could easily sell to because they had such a shit system and shit setup. So I just stretched them over here because they weren't the sexy businesses to sell to. And that's like how I was successful at Zoom. And I always think about that in all the business stuff I do now, like who's the people with the biggest gap. So I want to tell you that story because when it comes to LinkedIn DMs and when you're messaging people, like, are you reaching out to ideal clients that have a big gap? And when you message these people, are they even aware of the gap? That's the issue. Because like so many people, like LinkedIn creators, they'll say, what do? I'm a commenting specialist or I'm an engagement specialist, right? But like when you say things like that and you talk to people, they don't actually know what the gap is. Like they might be like, sure, if you comment, what actually happens? And so when you're having conversations with people, you need to make sure that like you're stretching the gap. You're making them aware of the issues that they have and then saying what it could be without. And so this is like classic sales is like on the first meeting you ever have with a client or a prospect, what you want to do is you want to say, hey, what are your problems? Tell me about your problems for 15 minutes. Because you want to like get them to vent and you want to build this gap for like, okay, you're here now. Oh, you've actually got all these problems. You're actually all the way back here, right? And then what you say, what are your goals? And then what's possible? And then you push it all the way back up. And so what you do is you create this massive gap where they are now and where they want to be able to hit their goals. And you're like, cool, we can fill that gap. And there's a guy called Keenan who wrote this book called Gap Selling. I think I'm paraphrasing it, whatever you want to call this book, but you need to create a massive gap. And a lot of the time the gap it's not the money that people are losing. It's not that they're losing money right now per month and you're helping them save money. It's what you're telling them is what's called the opportunity cost gap. So when you reach out, the biggest gap, like the biggest gap that people have is like by not knowing to do the skill, they can't do the thing. So if I was selling LinkedIn lead gen, they might realize that they're spending 10 hours a week on LinkedIn and they're getting one lead, but then I show them a client who's in the exact same industry who's getting 15 leads a week for the same time. So in their mind, what that's created is that's a gap of 14 leads, and that's a gap of $400,000 a year, and that they didn't even know existed before. And so you need to make sure, for one, when you pick your target market, is there a gap? Is there a big enough gap? And then selling to early stage tech startups and selling them how to do tech stuff is there really a massive gap? Or could they just go on YouTube and watch how to do this, and they might even be smarter than you, that they can just knock it out in 2 hours, right? Or are they someone else who there is a massive gap there, but are they aware of the gap? And then can you sell into that gap? Because if they're not aware, there's a lot of small business owners, a lot of legacy business owners on LinkedIn, right? They might be an accountant, right? And they need more business. But the problem is, for those type of people, they aren't even aware that the gap exists. They don't even know that you can produce leads on LinkedIn. And so that's what good marketing does. It educates them on the gap, so then when they become aware, then they might be someone that might want to buy. But you've got to make sure that when you're DMing people, that you're stretching this gap. And then when you're having sales meetings, you're stretching this gap. So then you sell into the gap. So when you propose the price of the thing that you do, it's in the gap and makes total sense. Anyways, guys, hope you enjoyed this episode of the podcast. Really appreciate you giving me 5 stars. Otherwise, peace out. Have a good day.